Sup nerds, time for a heavy pivot into TTRPGs. Specifically, my current obsession. No one pays me to do this, by the way. I only follow what the autism tells me to do. And right now it's telling me to talk about Lancer relentlessly, probably for the next 4 years, because that's how long it takes for this to get out of my system. Anyway, Lancer is a traditional TTRPG in the sense that it has one storyteller and a group of players all playing their own characters, in this case pilots who control mechs, like Gundams, which is something I love and talk about too much and my friends are subjected to all the time. But of course a lot of traditional TTRPGs prefer a fantasy setting, and obviously Lancer is more in a sci-fi setting, and you get to pilot these cool ass mechs like this one or this one or this one. That one's a little weird, but we'll get into that. We'll touch on it later. The big thing is the combat is a refreshing take on TTRPGs. I've noticed as we started deviating into a couple of PBTAs and other certain RPGs that over time that combat has they have almost shied away from combat, trying to make flatten encounters to where skill encounters, social stuff, and combats are turned into one same system, which isn't necessarily bad. But the shying away from combat means that a lot of the systems either have incredibly light combat to where it doesn't feel as rewarding for me, or they are trying to add mechanics that don't necessarily have the same payoffs. Lancer doubles down and gives you an incredibly rich combat experience where a lot of your decision making in terms of deployment, what actions you take on your turn, how to handle positioning and everything really boils down to having tangible rewards, as well as having different scenarios, or sit-reps as they're called in Lancer, for how to play a certain combat with different goal-oriented approaches to victory. I just love that, and I love a new system that incorporates that. And Lancer features this post-scarcity humanity that took several failed attempts in the process of getting there, but even after they've achieved this post-scarcity supposed utopia, there's still problems. So let's get into it. Let's talk about Lancer. As per usual, if you like it, be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help. And drop a comment if there's something you found particularly interesting. That always helps. I do have a Patreon. I'm trying to update it more. I know I haven't for the past year, but I appreciate everyone who supports me. You're all awesome. There's something that was really important to me when I started getting into Lancer, and it's of the free version, the foreword. And I want to read that to you first. In this book, there are some fraught, difficult, or otherwise uncomfortable themes and content discussed. Lancer takes place in a setting recovering from a millennia of cruel anthro-chauvinist rule, a fascist, imperial, Earth-first ideology that had little time, space, or care to acknowledge beings or perspectives that ran counter to their didactic tyranny. We want to acknowledge that many phenomena and acts touched on in Lancer, slavery, exploitation, racism, directed hate, genocide, the stealing of indigenous land, are real phenomena, are ongoing acts of injustice and cruelty, and are not simply fantasy or interesting devices to use in a role-playing game. Their inclusion in Lancer is by no means a flippant choice intended to be read as endorsement or idle thought. We think it is important to acknowledge that both writers, Tom and Miguel, are writing from a perspective of straight, cis, able-bodied men. When writing Lancer, we wanted to create a setting where humanity is, in the narrative present, at once both in a state of utopia and working to affect it. We imagine that Union isn't burdened by the same cultural definitions of gender that oppress and malign so many people who live under the umbrella of capitalism and empire, and, as such, there is a wide spectrum of expression and identity in Union and among its constituent worlds. At the risk of enacting further violence by depicting worlds and cultures where there are regressive or discriminatory stances on gender baked in, we have decided not to codify in the rules how players may express themselves. Please do note that this absence of canonical definition is absolutely not meant to be read as exclusion, but is instead meant to avoid flattening all possible stories into one canon definition of what it is to be gendered, transgender, non-binary, to have a body in Lancer. We encourage you to play your characters how you see them and consider them to be in canon. We hope that you create narratives and characters that stand against terrible abuses and prejudices. Lancer features no easy aliens to pass these transgressions upon, only other human beings. Humanity alone are the architects of terrible cruelties, but we can also be the architects of better, more just futures and presents. I found that to be particularly powerful. Not only that last paragraph, which sounds, first off, very interesting in that I do think that a lot of settings that I do find, like alien, monstrous, or some other thing to be like, look, they're doing the evil, and not bringing forth the fact that we as humans do this on our own. And they seem incredibly aware of the fact that these are, ongoing phenomena. And also the idea of however you choose what it is in your setting. If you're like, hey, my character has this kind of, anything to do with gender, not only is it canon, it's accepted, and like everything is good to go. Don't worry about how your character expresses. That is how you want to include it. And if you don't think like, oh, that's not important to me, you don't have to include it in your game. And that's lovely. The fact that they're like, whatever you choose to do is canon. And that's lovely. So let's talk about this wonderful world of gay space communism. Humanity has achieved its ultimate goals. We have food, we have healthcare, we have housing. Take a hint, politicians. Humanity is, in this perfect sense, we have these core worlds that have everything you could need, and the people could live here forever and want for nothing. Life is perfect. It took years, lifetimes of work to get to this point. And core worlds do not become this utopia overnight. Access to material, FTL, travel, having access to blank space, which we'll touch on later. And blank space is only available because of Ra, which we'll also touch on later. And only those worlds that do follow the pillars of Union. Union's basically the majority of humanity at this point. But really in this world, everything is, perfection. So, if everything's so perfect, why is there mech combat? Why is there any fighting? Sounds like they got their stuff settled. Why do we need to fight? Is this like some cool, we put on arena tournaments for entertainment? No, not at all. So here's the thing. When I said the core worlds have these cool nifty features, slight problem. Only a fraction of humanity, and I mean a small fraction, live on core worlds. Due to something that happened years before Lancer starts, there's a wide expansion of humanity, and Union is still trying to catch people up, trying to get people, access to these things, and it has been an incredibly slow process, of which some people don't even want them. Diasporan worlds vary from this is nice, but we still have problems, to life is hell and this is where I live, and everything in between. And unfortunately, most people kind of land on the this is hell spectrum of it, which is awful. Some colonies have been abandoned for centuries. Some isolated planets have been for 500 years left undiscovered by Union. So ultimately, how do people get these incorporated? How do we get people into better situations? And how do we get them to want it? Because some people, these are Union still wearing the same uniforms that they had before, when their ancestors learned that, they are doing a fascism. How can you trust them again? Who's to say they're not that abusive boyfriend? Ultimately, there's a lot of factors that come into how the universe is built, how people are not necessarily trusting, or just ultimately on their own or forgotten. And the problem is, you have to learn to, keep the peace. There's pirates, there's scoundrels, there's renegades, there are separatist factions that have holdouts from the previous regime. There's just a lot going on, and not everything is as peaceful as, they want it to be. So they have a navy, and when they need to have some bit of control, they send in the navy when, victory is basically all but assumed. But if they really want something to go right, they drop in the Lancers. Lancers are just human, almost never from Earth, which is now called Cradle. They're just cool-ass kind of their own mercenary type individuals that live within Union, that Union utilizes to do some of their work. Alternatively, other, corpros and other things that operate within Union also can potentially rely on Lancers, because they get the job done. Lancers pilot highly customized mechs, and they can even rebuild some of these mechs from mission to mission, kind of change their loadouts and everything, and they have a various amount of mounts, basic frames and systems that you can use to customize the mech you pilot, and that is what you are playing. You all start with the same frames to build from and the same set of gear. with only a few little bits of difference, where some of you will pick certain cool ass talents that'll be a little bit different from each other. But over time, you'll notice that one of the characters has this cool new ability when they invade enemy systems. Another one now is the ability to control enemy drones. Someone unlocked some cool weapon that suddenly they charge up and this big chain gun just starts mowing down enemies. Another one now can move away from enemies, not provoke reactions, and still get to keep moving. Then you realize, man, all of us have drastically changed how we operate, and that's cool as you start to diverge from this base starting point. It's more customization than you could ask for. There's literally dozens of frames in the starting book, and not only that, but they are adding more over time. Even some of it are a little third party, but even then there's still some first party frames that do get added over time, and I think that's really cool. The frames just determine like the base, like hit points and armor and speed and what kind of mounts and a few other core abilities that come to it. Ultimately though, you can say like, hey, you know what? I want this cool ass spear that comes from like learning the Nelson frame. And you're like, cool, you have the spear. That doesn't mean the spear only goes on the Nelson frame. You can put that spear on anything. And that's the part that really starts to get cool. You can pick up weapons from certain licenses, put them on frames of other licenses, while then grabbing support systems from other licenses and mishmashing it all together. There is no restriction outside of like, you have these many types of mounts. So certain mounts, like a goblin doesn't have a heavy mount, so you couldn't put a heavy weapon on a goblin. But that does mean any of the goblin systems, which give you some cool systems, you can put some of the goblin systems onto other mechs and be like, hey, look at this cool thing. I come up with this minotaur that has some of the systems of a goblin, and now it's got the weapon from a Tortuga. You're like, wow. And you suddenly realize, as you pick and choose, you've come up with your own custom thing, and it is super cool. You know what? You know what you do with all these cool mechs? Once you get there, you kick fucking ass. That's what you do. It's tactical TTRPG combat, and that's the part that I think is really neat. Like, it's still got a D20 system, but you only use D20s and D6s. As a way to adjust accuracy, there's going to be a mechanic called accuracy and difficulty. Accuracy allows you to still roll the D20 roll, but then you roll a D6, and you can increase the roll by that amount. You get accuracy from, like, lock-ons. Certain weapons are especially more accurate than others. Some weapons are more inaccurate than others, so you have to deal with that, as well as there's other ways. There's just other ways to get accuracy from various benefits as well. However, there's a lot of ways that enemies can impose difficulty of you, like behind soft or hard cover. You could potentially get impaired, which is a status effect. And there's just lots of ways where positioning can have a significant effect on the accuracy of a roll. Because there's not huge, like, you don't like roll for strength and stamina and stuff like that at the start, you don't really get a bonus. Most people are rolling with +0 to hit. So a lot of the defenses in Lancer range from, I think, at the start between like 8 and 12. So even 8, I need 8 to hit. But 8 to hit behind hard cover, and hard cover on average mathematically gives you like -4 to hit, means that you're going to need at least like a 12 to hit on like the easiest to hit enemy. I think some of them get to 12. Suddenly you need like 16 to hit some of these particularly agile NPCs that are hiding behind hard cover on like an average roll. And you have to go, okay, how do we deal with that? Well, there's a few ways. You could try to say, hey, friend, you can invade them. Can you like use one of your invades and move them out of cover? And you're like, oh yeah, now that they're out of cover, let's, we can freely shoot on them. Or like, you know what? I have a weapon that like does a blast, and maybe we can knock them back, and then they're out of position. I have another player who literally destroys cover. So enemies are hiding behind stuff. He just blows it up and like, okay, I'm glad you were hiding behind that. Now you're not. Or sometimes you'll just like be able to say, hey, this lane is dangerous. You go out, flank them, and now they have to try to get cover from two sources. And maybe that certain firing lane just doesn't have the ability to get cover from both. And you take advantage of that. And it's that kind of controlling space, that kind of communication and teamwork where you realize that the tactics of how you approach a situation just becomes so rewarding. So not only you have the strategy of how do you choose to build your mechs, how do you choose to build your team, and talk amongst your other Lancers and figure out what should we do. You also have the ability of how do you play and navigate those live. Once shit's hit the fan, how do you adapt to that situation? Like, oh, this isn't what we expected. How are you going to overcome that? And that's cool. This is the crunchy combat that I really wanted. The outmaneuvering, the ability to like lock on, like, hey, I shot this guy, but you need help. I'm going to lock on. So on your turn, you get a bonus to accuracy to make sure that big hit lands. It's a fun, crunchy, gritty system where you try to juggle all this in this wonderful world where there's like pirates, renegade forces, weirdo stuff. There's just a lot of interesting things going on, a lot of it very political. So I've mentioned Union earlier and just now. So I think we should get, first off, into what is Union and how it came to be. And this section is a little bit longer. In the future, after we've discovered space travel and stuff, we f*** up Earth. It's inevitable that conditions worse over the next hundreds of years, and yeah. Okay, we f***ed up, but we start building 10 big ships capable of sustaining people for lifetimes and traveling across galaxies. The first is launched and makes landfall, and then the rest of the 10 are deployed. Earth no longer has a significant portion of its population, and the majority of humanity is now spread amongst the stars. Over the next few centuries, what follows is catastrophic ecological collapse and mass extinction and climate change. Earth is screwed. Now called Cradle, the human population fell from 15 billion to fewer than 500,000 humans. All contact with the 10 ceases, and they're now recovering from what this is called the Fall. Humanity starts anew. A few millennia later, they get access to the pre-fall vaults, which quickly catch humanity back to where they were before. It's a few millennia later, Earth has time to recover. Humans die, but Earth takes a long time for her to recover from what we did to it. So as Cradle becomes more habitable and humans kind of rebuild and they access these pre-fall vaults, they now have oh look, we can get back to where we were. This isn't a lost cause. We can go back to the stars. Here's the problem though. Cradle goes into a global war over control of the vaults. And after 5 decades, Union is founded, and the first committee of Union is made. And it's now just called FirstComm. There's going to be FirstComm, SecComm, and ThirdComm over the course of this, just first, second, and third. And then over the next millennia, humanity returns to the stars. After Union lands on their moon, Luna, they rediscover the Theseus shipyard and find all these sorts of abilities to, oh look, we have these blueprints to rebuild interstellar traveling ships. So rather than trying to how did we do this before, they just have the ability to immediately start building those again. They find the star charts of the predecessors, and here we go back to the stars and rediscovering and discovering things again. They recover some distress beacons from the 10. Some less fortunate messages are discovered. They find old colonies, some abandoned, some still populated this many millennia later. And just places that have been forgotten and rediscovered over the next previous 6,000 years. They find the Oracle Chorus machine on Mars, and that allows them to have some predictions, because it's this lovely system that they're able to put in scenarios, and then they're able to learn little bit things about what can happen in the future. And with that, FirstComm begins its first major expansion. Over the next 1,000 years, Union, they're rediscovering these colonies and stuff. They start to integrate the old isolated colonies and planets into a Union again, and they make the UAD, an administrative committee meant to bring the old back into the new. As Union had access to everything they needed on Cradle, to the vaults, to the shipyard, to the chorus installation, all that, Union was actually able to progress past some of the other places of where the 10 was launched or where the previous humanity had deployed. So in some cases, even though they had some of the people in the stars had more technology initially, over the millennia, Union had actually passed them. So they sometimes have to catch some of these worlds or colonies up to them upon their arrival. Eventually, they discover the Onic people. The people of On were descendants of the Ryla and the Armstrong, 2 of the 10 that had landed relatively close to the same area. And Union becomes at odds with them at the Boundary Garden, and it does lead to war. Some anthro-chauvinist members within Union began taking hostile actions against them. Anthro-chauvinist being more of a Earth-first ideology where humanity is kind of using the universe as its own resource. Things are not necessarily cherished to be preserved. Things are just meant to be used and spent for the sake of progressing humanity. And these very authoritarian, incredibly right-wing people end up kind of taking over. However, the disorganized, ideological, and sometimes even naive FirstComm falls in the process during this, and SecComm takes over. SecComm is now in control of the fancy prediction machine I mentioned on Mars, called the Five Voices. The Five Voices manifests Monist 1, which is the first NHP, non-human personnel, They're kind of like AI, except not, but they're basically like their own entity. They think on their own, like a human, but they're not. Anyway, Monist 1 takes the moon it's on, Deimos, and just boop, vanishes it. Gone. Which is, that's pretty big to like just make a moon disappear. I know that happens a little bit more common in DBZ. It's more rare in Lancer. Monist 1 and Union eventually kind of come up with some agreement to recognize NHPs as their own persons, and Union begins the shackling process of basically learning how to control NHPs and like kind of give them boundaries and kind of make, weaponize them essentially. Union under SecComm has some kind of shady tactics, not gonna lie. But Monist 1, now called Ra, does give them access to a lot of technology, including the ability to have blink space, which is far faster than FTL travel to move between like spaces in place. And they start assembling things called blink gates. And with that, the second expansion period begins. SecComm, with its incredibly authoritarian right-wing motives, begins a massive Union-wide colonization effort of all the planets and colonies, everything as far out as they can reach. It marks the largest movement of humanity in recorded history up until this point, even up to the point where Lancer starts. This is the biggest motion of humans, just everywhere. Colonize here, get here, get here. Everything needs to be taken by Union. The Blink network is grown. They colonize thousands of worlds, and they do actually in this process to encounter an alien race. And SecComm, being an incredibly right-wing, they just kill them all. They kill them all. In the process of this, GMS, General Massive Systems, is kind of recognized to be one of the winners at killing things. So General Massive Systems becomes a major producer of these new chassis which we're just going to call mechs. And this is kind of when mechs really take over in the system, where they realize that this is the leader. These things kick ass. And they start adding these chassis and outfitting their soldiers with these to use in combat. So the age of mechs is born. Within that, General Massive Systems has existed for a long time. And there's other manufacturers at this time who are also kind of developing their own chassis based off of some of the stuff GMS did. As well as, at that point in time, SecComm heavily used this much younger corporation called the Harrison Armory. And the Harrison Armory ends up producing some of these basically genocide machines. They're not great. So with the idea that internally some of the people realize politically that in the process of this colonization and this effort, as people move around, they really don't really care on how do we sustain these people once they're there. Once we fully exploit this world, what do we do with the people that are there? We've just destroyed this entirely new civilization. We've aggregated some of our previous people that had sent in the 10, the Onic people. Everything is in this kind of growing state of unrest over time, up until the point where revolution naturally begins. Chaos spreads among the core worlds, and Union is sent plummeting into civil war. Decades of war later, SecComm does surrender and ThirdComm is formed. ThirdComm founds the Pillars of Union, which we'll get to in just a second, but instead of focusing on the consolidation of power, on focusing on colonizing and building as much as possible, instead of focusing on weapons and militarization, they push towards getting their citizens to have the ability to live, to sustain themselves, to have what it is to live a joyous life. And with that, they found these tenets. All shall have their material needs fulfilled. No walls shall stand between worlds. No human shall be held in bondage through force, labor, or debt. Under Union, it is paramount that all humans are afforded the decency of a life which their basic needs are met. The state must make food, water, shelter, and just labor available to all, and never deny those rights. Take a hint, politicians! To do so is to violate the most basic of social contracts. The void of interstellar space is deep, cold, and utterly hostile to life. Any civilian world, station, or moon not granted restrictions by Union edict must grant access to those who petition, allowing all to have firm ground beneath their feet and the ability to breathe clean air and the light of a life-giving sun. The scarcity of natural resources is a false premise, a myth, a tool used to oppress others. The dignity of human life is paramount on all worlds. To exploit people for their labor and deny just compensation is abhorrent. In the fallout of this, Harrison and some SecComm people go to some other system. The Karakan trade baronies. Eventually, they have this interest war, and Union acts as the intermediary of them. Harrison 1 is brought to Cradle to face justice for his actions. The trade baronies do join Union in the premise that the Harrison Armory, who they've had some issues with, also be forced to be given to Union and taken away from Harrison 1, who, faces just consequences for his terrible actions during SecComm. Humanity's core thrives during these periods, and they develop these core worlds where they do provide the utopia I described earlier in the video. But the bigger problem has been, how do we create this utopian society? How do we decide who we do it next to? How do we advance and build these, bring these core worlds about so that people can have access to them? How do we convince the people that are living on diaspora that they should join these core worlds? And how do we find some of the ones that we've lost connection with? And ultimately, that's kind of where ThirdComm is struggling a little bit. Although they are clearly able to provide these core worlds with a lovely life, they're still having a little bit of issues dealing with the politics of the fallout of that centuries of authoritarian rule and dealing with it. Because as much as you want to just say, everyone come here, it's just not as easy as that. Some are separated by huge amounts of space. Some are separated by the fact that they don't know they're there anymore. In the fall of where SecComm let things fall apart, there are pirates and other terrible things going. It's ultimately, things aren't necessarily great. About 500-ish centuries into ThirdComm, the Onic people who were agitated at the end of FirstComm and the entire time during SecComm do destroy the blink gate near them. This is the first and only known hostile action of destroying of blink gates, and with it, the Onic people go to war with Union. And now we're caught up. We're missing some details because ultimately if I'm like, hey, here's a whole video on the history of Union, I think it would have taken much longer than that. I tried to compress, and hopefully I didn't screw up too many details with that, but I am pretty sure we've got a little bit of where we were, how we got here, and ultimately that's kind of where we are. But now we know that there's clearly reasons for there to be military actions, but Union doesn't necessarily build the mechs by themselves. They have manufacturers. So let's get into the manufacturers that you can get your mechs from. I want to go over that there are roles in Lancer. There's Defender, there's Striker, there's Artillery, there's Support, and there are Controllers. Defenders kind of try to, as the name suggests, they provide protection in the form of a variety of ways to prevent their fellow mechs from being harmed. Support, either enable or buff or potentially heal other mechs. Striker and Artillery both deal damage, but Strikers focus on getting up close and personal and often might have some sort of other mechanics of either protecting themselves or being able to advance into place. And Artillery have lots of long-range things and sometimes the ability to change in how they deal damage at range. And Controllers have the ability to either debuff enemies or kind of create and change the nature of the battlefield you're fighting on. The boring one, General Massive Systems. General Massive Systems is the basic thing. Everyone gets access to the Everest, and there's a couple of Everest variants, the Sagarmatha and the Coma Lukma. I really have trouble saying it without laughing. Like Coma Ligma. Anyway, the chassis were proven to work under SecComm. GMS took over, and ultimately every Lancer has access to all GMS systems, all GMS weapons, and all GMS frames, which for most people is just going to be the Everest anyway. They're not hyper specialized, but you can have cool new weapon systems and to them. So even if you do like the Everest is one of the coolest core powers in the game. They're just really good, but they're not hyper specialized, and ultimately giving you access to that at the start is kind of just nice. But there's some other ones. Let's talk about space trucks. IPS-Northstar, two big companies merged together, Interplanetary Shipping and Northstar, and they basically created a monopoly on interstellar shipping. IPS-Northstar now is the largest fleet ever amassed. With the merger, some of their old mechs they used to safeguard ship from like pirates and stuff have become more proprietary, and they now offer those to Lancers and others who need a little bit more armor. IPS-Northstar mechs definitely have a little bit of durability and often excel at being up close and personal, even though some do kind of have some more range capacity. IPS-Northstar also names all of its stuff after pirates. The Blackbeard allows you to pull enemies towards you and force them into deadly melee with your harpoon. The Drake is a durable armored fortress. The Lancaster launches repair drones. The Nelson hits harder after moving and moves after every melee swing. The Rayleigh gets free reloads on turns where you don't attack, and then free shots on turns where you reload. The Tortuga locks down enemies with close-range opportunity attacks, and the Vlad spikes anyone who hits it within close range. And now's the Smith-Shimano Corpro. It was founded initially on private interstellar travel, but the Smith-Shimano Corpro focused initially on rich clientele during the pre-ThirdComm era. Nowadays, they have bespoke mechs, hard suits, and kind of perfecting the human body. It's giving Weebs meet the Nordstrom fashion show with a little bit of Gundam, which already kind of falls under Weebs. If you aren't aware, I love Gundam. This is the G-Quux and the Red Gundam from... Anyway, we don't need to talk about that now, but it's got sleek silhouettes, destruction with style. They focus on giving you the suit you need to do your job while also being beautiful in the process. The SSC, all of their suits are named after moths and butterflies. The Black Witch resists kinetic damage and can parry kinetic damage from herself or allies. The Death's Head has mega long sensors and very accurate long-range attacks. The Duskwing is a very lightweight suit and is very maneuverable and can drop holographic images. The Metal Mark temporarily goes invisible and blends in with cover. The Monarch's missiles splash damage and can ignore cover and line of sight on locked-on enemies. The Morning Cloak is nothing personal, kid. And it hits harder against lonely enemies and can teleport. The Swallowtail can go invisible and adds debuffs on enemies with lock-ons and can drop swarms to prevent damage. HORUS. So they're weird. They operate between like small OmniNet communities to like greater collectives, and they're everywhere. Are they like a cult? Are they like a group of deep net hackers? Are they terrorists? I mean, probably all of that. They're kind of all that. They kind of, they vary. But they have their licenses, if you want to call them licenses. Some are discovered like on accident. They stumbled upon hidden deep within the deep net. Some of things are in a different time or in the future that just kind of appear in this timeline, and people discover the blueprints. And as a result, they're building this frame for the first time in this. They have really weird concepts. HORUS isn't really a manufacturer so much as they are, HORUS. They have some kind of unstable builds that are kind of impossible to understand too. And they're named after fantasy creatures, which I do think is pretty cool. The Baylor kind of has antimatter. It's constantly regenerating and it splits the matter of things that are near it. The Goblin is a very tiny super hacker that can latch onto other mechs. The Gorgon can take additional reactions and paralyze enemy attackers. The Hydra sends out drones that can attack and debuff enemies. The Manticore castigates the enemies of the Godhead. It does kill its high pilot when it explodes, but it also causes the destruction of the temple of the enemies of Ra. The Minotaur grinds enemies' speed to a halt until they become stunned, and the Pegasus extrude gun and provides low but reliable ranged damage. Remember when SecComm, I said Harrison won and was sent to Cradle and the Harrison Armory was brought under Union? You can actually pilot some of those mechs. The Harrison Armory did make a huge showing during, as they eventually come along. They really only come on during SecComm, and the other manufacturers are known for a while. So this was kind of like the new kids in town, but they built some weapons with some significant firepower, sometimes focusing on fire and power, but they have tough, durable, heavy weapons. These literal war criminals are named after literal war criminals. The Barbarossa is a massive weapon platform that sports the Apocalypse rail. The Genghis is immune to fire and can overheat to vent fire on its foes. The Iskander can throw grenades and mines at long distances, and many of them at once. The Napoleon is a small armored suit that can parry this casual on ranged attacks. The Saladin is a durable mech that can reduce the damage and accuracy of incoming attacks of itself and allies. The Sherman can overcharge, and when it vents heat, it charges its main cannon and shoots off smoke. The Takugawa wants to overheat so it can deal additional energy and burn damage to its enemies. So that's Union. Those are the mechs. That's kind of like my thoughts on the system. So why do I like it? I love Stompy Mechs. If you weren't aware, this is just a fraction. I've got a bunch of I really got into mecha stuff back in Evangelion Toonami. I initially got into it with or like Toonami or Adult Swim. I got into like Evangelion, and which I didn't realize was like kind of a deconstruction of other things. But then I got into Gundam Wing, and Gundam Wing is super my style, even though Evangelion I like more. But Gundam Wing was like, look at all these cool ass mechs. You got the cool things. I loved Death Scythe, and Dual Maxwell was cool. I was kind of edgy as a teenager. I mean, yeah, you know, whatever. But I just thought it was like super cool. And like honestly, mechs have like stuck around me for a while. As I later in life I got more back into like anime and stuff, I'm like, dude, mechs are still super cool. I wanted more of it, so I started watching more and more Gundam, and I'm like, man, this is great. I wish we had a system like that. Eventually I had some friends tune me into BattleTech, and clearly Miguel, Tom, or both have taken a lot of influence from BattleTech, even though I know a lot of people are like, hey, there's some similarities with Gundam. Like, I think it's a little bit closer to BattleTech, but there's certainly some parallels one can find with Gundam. So ultimately, I think that just having mech combat is cool, but like that's a selling point for me. But that's not the selling point. The big thing is the combat matters. I've been a little wanting a system where we do have like rich combat, where we feel like we have tangible consequences to like actual combat actions. So as you go through combat, finding ways where sit reps, where if you complete this situation report, sit rep successfully, there are narrative consequences. And not only that, but there's many ways of handling these combats. Like I described earlier, the idea of like figuring out how to outmaneuver, the managing your structure so you're not taking too much damage, because you're like, cool, we have only a limited number of repair over the course of this mission. If you burn through too much of your structure and then repairing that structure to the point where you're at this like last part of the mission and you realize like, I can't even take hits. How do you get through that combat where you're like, okay, I need to play very carefully, and then realizing that there is like a limit to how much you can be repaired, a limit to how much you can handle, or there's maybe you should play more cautiously and you try to figure out ways of dealing with enemies in a different approach as you learn the system. It's just really fucking fun. And not only that, but as a DM, some of the designs of like the NPCs get really cool. NPCs definitely like hit harder, but they're not nearly as durable. The Lancers with their multiple structure definitely can take a hit and they have some staying power, but the NPCs can punch hard. It's more so just like a numbers game to balance things out. So it's not that the NPCs have better weapons, but they definitely can appear deadly if people don't deal with a crap ton of NPCs all at once, just blowing them up. But we found that from just a minimal amount of playing through Operation Solstice Rain, which has been super fun, that we're a big fan, and we need more of this now and all the time. And the DM note is kind of cool on how you build NPCs, because NPCs aren't static. Like, you can give the Spectre cool different like systems. You can apply templates, like, you know, in 4th edition, like they're called grunts or like minions, but there were elites in both 4th edition and in Lancer, and the solo/boss mechanics of 4th edition D&D come over in the form of ultras, and you can build really, really cool custom enemies that are really powerful if you want to like make them fight some sort of Shar Aznable. And anyway, what I'm going to try to say is Shar Aznable is great. He's fantastic. I know he's like an antagonist, but I have trauma is what it is. That's why I like him. Shar is fantastic. On that, I know I talked about D&D 4th edition several times. Why not talk about D&D 5th edition? Ultimately, I'm kind of burnt out on D&D. Specifically 5th edition. I thought 3rd edition was pretty good. I did enjoy 3rd edition a lot. 2nd edition was fine. I enjoyed that mostly because it was really all I had access to at the time. I didn't have access to a lot of other TTRPGs, or didn't know about them is really what it was. There have been TTRPGs available for like ever, but you know, D&D was kind of like the big one. And over the course of this, I think 5th edition has kind of had this big thing, and people are like, I want to play a RPG, let's play D&D, and it's always 5th edition, and I'm kind of burnt out. I don't think it's that great a system. I don't think it's bad. I think it's one of those where, since everyone wants to play it, and sure, I've played it a bunch, I don't need that much of it. Like, I love Gloomhaven. I've played Gloomhaven to death, but I can play Gloomhaven to death because I love it, but I don't have the same love for 5th edition. Like, my favorite D&D was 4th edition D&D. I felt like it handled combat far more effectively than the others. I could go on 4th edition for a long time, so I'm not going to really add that rant to this video, but I think that a lot of people didn't give it a good shot, and Lancer takes a lot of inspiration, I think, from 4th edition, and it does it incredibly well. And it does its own thing incredibly well too. So I've just been burnt out on things, and this is exactly what I needed. I know some people have suggested, hey Alice, you should play Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I wasn't a huge fan of Pathfinder 1st Edition, but from what I've seen of Pathfinder 2nd, it looks really promising, and I really want to play it. So I will eventually get to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because that one does look really cool. And also, there's a big change between, like, you know, we're in the grim darkness of the future. There is only war. Yeah. Grimdark dystopian is a big, like, trend in the thing. But I like the fact that they have a utopian thing. We have, like, we have found the way to have the perfect worlds. It's lovely. And I find that fantastic. Slight problem, though. The fact that it's not like everything's perfect, we still have to have these blah, blah, blah. It's definitely a different change rather than everything's bad, the government's bad, the manufacturers and corporations are bad. Like everything is oppressing and awful. Taking this to Union, really, ThirdComm, it really is the good guys. We've got wonderful, like, you know, gay space communism. Like everything is provided to its people. But like dealing with the, you know, previous right-wing movement that had taken over and like the fallout of that, and how do you approach it rather than like just dealing in this dystopian world, which is, it's just been overdone. I don't dislike dystopian worlds and settings, but it's done to the point where this utopian setting feels refreshing for a change. That's all. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on Lancer. I know I talked for a bit long on this, but fantastic. I really love Lancer and hope you give it a shot. So hopefully this video is informative or entertaining, hopefully both. I do plan on doing more Lancer, kind of like some Operation Debriefs. I might do some guides. I typically do like class guides for Gloomhaven, Frosthaven, so I might get to that in Lancer eventually when I feel more you know, into that. But also I might also do some stuff on how, like, GMing Lancer, because I feel like even with only a little bit of access to GMing Lancer now, I feel like my decades of DMing experience has paid off to the point where I have a very good grasp on how to do this effectively in some cases, and I would like to share my thoughts on effectively being a good GM. So I feel like that's something from my experience with other storytellers and people, you know, RPG horror stories, I feel like some people could use a little bit of DM advice, and maybe I'll do something like that. If you have your own ideas, like, hey, this would be cool Lancer content, please let me know in the comments. I love to hear your thoughts. So speaking of love to hear you guys, all of you are amazing. Special thanks to my patrons, especially those that stuck it out during my long hiatus. I'm really sorry about that. I already did a video on, you know, we're back. I explained it all. I don't need to explain it again, but I appreciate all of you. You're wonderful people, and I truly appreciate you, and thank you so much, and thank all of you for watching.